The auction block stood in the center of Redemption Springs like a rotting tooth, weathered gray from too many years of sun and shame. Dust swirled around it in lazy spirals, kicked up by boots that had seen everything and believed in nothing. The crowd gathered thick, mostly men, their faces hard as the desert rock that surrounded the town on all sides. Nathaniel Cross stood at the back, hat pulled low, arms crossed over his chest. He had not come to buy. He had come because loneliness does strange things to a man, and watching other people's misery sometimes made his own feel smaller by comparison. The auctioneer, a weasel of a man named Polk, wiped sweat from his neck with a stained kerchief and gestured to the woman being led onto the platform. She wore black from neck to ankle, a widow's dress that had seen better days, patched at the elbows and hem. Her hair, dark as coal dust, hung in a single braid down her back. She kept her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if refusing to see them meant they could not see her. "Gentlemen," Polk's voice carried over the murmur of the crowd. "This here is Mrs. Josephine Hartley, recently widowed. Husband died owing considerable debts to Mr. Crenshaw, who has generously agreed to settle the matter through this sale. She's strong, can cook, clean, and comes with a wagon and 2 horses. Starting bid is $50. Nathaniel felt his jaw tighten. He knew Crenshaw, knew the man's cruelty wore a respectable suit. The woman's husband had likely died in Crenshaw's mine, worked to death for wages that barely kept food on the table. 50, called a voice from the front. A railroad man, by the look of his clean clothes and soft hands. 60, came another, this one from a cattle baron Nathaniel recognized, a man who went through hired help like most men went through whiskey. Josephine's hands trembled at her sides, but her face remained stone. Nathaniel watched her swallow once, hard, and something in that simple gesture of barely contained fear made him move. $200, he said, his voice cutting through the din like an axe through kindling. The crowd went silent. Heads turned. Polk's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. 200? You sure about that, mister? Nathaniel stepped forward, pulling a worn leather pouch from his coat. He counted out gold coins, letting them clink onto Polk's table one by one. I am certain. No one bid higher. No one dared. 200 was more than the woman was worth by any accounting, and everyone knew it. It was the kind of bid that said, I am done here, challenge me and see what happens. Polk licked his lips, swept the coins into his palm, and nodded. Sold to Mr. Cross. Nathaniel walked to the platform. For the first time, Josephine looked directly at him. Her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds before rain, and they held a mixture of defiance and desperation that made his chest ache. Can you ride? He asked quietly. She nodded once. Then follow me. He led her through the crowd without looking back, past the saloons and the general store, to where his horse waited, a sturdy roan gelding with kind eyes. Behind it, tied to a post, stood the wagon Polk had mentioned, a small covered thing with wooden wheels and a canvas top bleached nearly white by the sun. 2 draft horses stood in the traces, their heads low. Nathaniel untied the wagon, handed Josephine the reins. Stay close. It is a day's ride to my land. Where? Her voice was hoarse, unused. North. Past the canyon, into the foothills. She said nothing more, just climbed onto the wagon seat with practiced ease and took up the reins. Nathaniel mounted his horse and started north, listening to the creak of the wagon wheels behind him, a sound that would follow him all the way home. They rode through the afternoon, through land that grew wild and untamed the farther they traveled from town. Sagebrush gave way to juniper, red rock cliffs rose on either side, and the air grew cooler as they climbed. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they had reached a narrow valley tucked between 2 ridges, where a creek ran cold and clear. Nathaniel's homestead sat at the valley's heart. It was not much to look at, a cabin built from pine logs, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a corral with split-rail fencing, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. But it was solid, built by his own hands, and it had kept him alive through 5 hard winters. He dismounted, helped Josephine down from the wagon. She stood looking at the cabin, her expression unreadable. "There is a room in the back," Nathaniel said. "It has a bed, a chest for your things, and a lock on the door. I will not enter without your permission." She turned to him, searching his face for lies. "Why did you buy me?" He had expected the question but had no good answer. "Because no one else should have." "That is not a reason." "It is the only one I have." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I will need water to wash. There is a pump by the barn. I will bring in your things." He unloaded the wagon while she walked to the pump, her movements stiff and exhausted. By the time he had carried the last of her belongings inside, she had returned, her face and hands clean, her braid dripping. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and shelves lined with books and tins of food ran along another. A door at the back led to the room he had mentioned. Josephine walked to it, paused at the threshold. "Thank you," she said without turning around. Then she stepped inside and closed the door. He heard the lock slide home. Nathaniel stood in the silence that followed, suddenly aware of how large the emptiness felt, how the sound of another person's breathing had already changed the shape of the air. He built up the fire, put coffee on to boil, and sat at the table to wait for morning. That first night, neither of them slept well. Nathaniel lay on the narrow cot he kept near the fireplace, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards from the back room. He wondered if she was afraid, if she regretted coming, if she would try to run. In the back room, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. The room was small but well kept, with a quilt folded at the foot of the bed and a small window that looked out toward the creek. A lamp burned low on the chest of drawers, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. She had expected worse. Had expected him to demand entry the moment they arrived, to claim what he had paid for. But the lock on the door was real, and she had heard him settle by the fire without protest. Still, trust was a luxury she could not afford, not yet, perhaps not ever. She lay down fully clothed, the knife she had hidden in her boot pressed against her thigh, and closed her eyes without sleeping. Morning came cold and bright. Nathaniel woke to find frost on the windows and the fire burned down to embers. He rebuilt it, put on coffee and cornmeal mush, and was frying salt pork when the back door opened. Josephine emerged dressed in the same black dress, her hair freshly braided. She looked at the food, then at him. "I can cook," she said. "I know. Then why are you doing it?" "Because you just arrived." He spooned mush into 2 bowls, added pork to each, and set them on the table. "Sit." She hesitated, then sat. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons on tin and the crackle of the fire. When they finished, Josephine gathered the dishes and carried them to the wash basin without being asked. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her back to him. Nathaniel considered the question. "Help, if you are willing. This land is hard to work alone. And if I am not willing? Then you are free to leave. I will not stop you." She turned, water dripping from her hands. "You spent $200. It is already spent. What you do now is your choice." She searched his face again, looking for the trap, the angle, the lie. But his eyes were steady, a dark brown that held no malice, only a weariness that matched her own. "I will stay," she said finally. "For now. That is enough." The days that followed settled into a rhythm, careful and cautious, like 2 wild animals circling the same watering hole. Nathaniel tended the horses, repaired the barn's sagging wall, and rode out each morning to check the small herd of cattle that grazed in the upper valley. Josephine cleaned the cabin, cooked meals that were better than anything he had tasted in years, and slowly began to reclaim pieces of herself she had thought lost. They spoke little at first, only what was necessary. Pass the salt. The fence needs mending. Rain coming tomorrow. But gradually, in the spaces between words, something else grew. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Josephine broke the silence. "Why do you live alone out here?" Nathaniel stirred the coals with an iron poker. "I had a wife once. And a son." The air went still. Josephine waited, knowing the shape of grief when she saw it. "Cholera," he continued, his voice flat. 7 years ago. Took them both in a week. Buried them on the ridge behind the house." He set the poker aside. "I came here afterward. Could not stay where everything reminded me of them. I am sorry." He nodded once. "Your husband?" "Mine collapse. Crenshaw's mine. They said it was an accident, but there were no safety timbers, no proper supports. Just men working until the mountain fell on them." Her hands twisted in her lap. "David was a good man. Quiet, but good. He deserved better. Most do." They sat in the shared silence of those who understood loss, and for the first time since Nathaniel had brought her home, the walls between them thinned just a little. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with teeth of ice and wind. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, drifted across the corral, and turned the world into a monochrome study of white and gray. They were snowed in for weeks, the two of them and the animals, isolated from the rest of the world. It was during those long, frozen days that they truly began to talk. Nathaniel told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to work wood from his father, about the war that had sent him west looking for peace. Josephine spoke of her own past, of growing up in a mining camp, of marrying David when she was barely 16, of the brief happiness they had found before Crenshaw's greed took it away. She also proved herself capable in ways that surprised him. When one of the horses colicked in the middle of a blizzard, she was the one who stayed up all night walking it, forcing it to move until the blockage passed. When the roof began to leak over the pantry, she climbed up with him, holding tar paper in place while he nailed it down, her hands steady despite the wind. "You are not what I expected," Nathaniel said one night as they played cards by the fire, a battered deck missing the 7 of spades. "What did you expect?" "Someone more, broken." Josephine laid down a card, her expression thoughtful. "I am broken. But broken things can still be sharp." He smiled slightly. "That they can." She won the hand, gathered the cards, and began to shuffle. "Why have you not tried to touch me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nathaniel met her eyes. "Because you are not property, despite what that auction said. And because I remember what it felt like to love someone freely, not because I owned them." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being the man you are." Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself had forgotten how to thaw. But eventually, the snow receded, the creek swelled with runoff, and green shoots pushed through the muddy earth. Nathaniel and Josephine worked side by side, planting a garden, repairing winter damage, bringing the cattle down from the high pastures. One warm afternoon, as they worked together mending fence posts, Josephine paused and looked out across the valley. The wildflowers had begun to bloom, painting the meadows in splashes of yellow and purple. "I never thought I could feel this," she said softly. "Feel what?" "Peace." Nathaniel drove the post deeper into the ground with steady blows. "Neither did I. Not after losing them." She turned to him. "Do you still think of them?" "Every day. But it hurts less now." He glanced at her. "You helped with that." Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly. But not before he saw the smile. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Josephine spoke again. I want to tell you something. All right. I am not barren. David and I, we wanted children, but they never came. The women in town whispered that I was cursed, that God was punishing me for some sin. She paused, her voice dropping. I believed them, for a while. Nathaniel said nothing, just listened. But I do not believe it anymore, she continued. I think sometimes the timing is just wrong, or the circumstances are not right. I think sometimes life waits until you are ready. He understood what she was really saying, what she was offering. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Josephine, he said quietly. Yes? Would you consider staying? Not as someone I bought, but as someone I want. She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing not the lonely rancher who had bid too much at an auction, but the man who had given her space to heal, who had treated her with kindness when the world had shown her only cruelty. Yes, she said. I would consider it. They were married in the summer, in a small ceremony at the Circuit Preacher's Church in Redemption Springs. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue that Nathaniel had bought from the seamstress, and he wore his one good suit, brushed clean and pressed. The few neighbors who knew them came to witness, and afterward, they shared cake and coffee in the churchyard. When they returned to the homestead, Josephine did not go to the back room. She went to the main bedroom, the one Nathaniel had built when he first arrived, with windows on two sides and a large bed he had made himself. He had not slept there since his first wife died, preferring the cot by the fire. But now, as Josephine stood in the doorway, he understood it was time. They moved slowly, carefully, learning each other like new language. There was tenderness in the way he touched her, as if she were something precious he was afraid to break. And there was a fierce determination in the way she held him, as if to say, I am here, I am real, I choose this. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled of lavender and sun, the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. Nathaniel, she whispered into the darkness. Yes? I love you. He pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her hair. I love you, too. It was the truth, simple and complete, and it changed everything. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The ranch grew, the herd multiplied, and the garden flourished under Josephine's careful tending. They built additions to the cabin, added a smokehouse and a chicken coop, and slowly transformed the lonely homestead into a home. But children did not come. Not the first year, nor the second, nor the third. Josephine felt the old whispers creep back into her mind, the cruel voices that said she was cursed, broken beyond repair. But Nathaniel would not let her believe them. You are not broken, he told her fiercely one night as she wept in his arms. You are whole, and you are mine, and that is enough. Do you hear me? You are enough. She clung to those words, let them be her anchor when the doubts threatened to drag her under. And then, in the fourth spring of their marriage, something changed. Josephine woke one morning feeling strange, unmoored, as if her body had become foreign to her. She dismissed it at first, blamed it on bad meat or too much sun. But when the feeling persisted, when her monthly courses did not come, she allowed herself to wonder. She waited another month to be sure, then another, too afraid to hope. But when she could no longer deny the small swell of her belly, the way her dresses grew tight, she finally told Nathaniel. They were in the barn, tending to a mare who had just foaled, when she spoke. I am with child. Nathaniel froze, his hand still on the horse's flank. Slowly, he turned to face her. Are you certain? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I am certain. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally pulled back, his own eyes were wet. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. The pregnancy was not easy. Josephine was sick in the mornings, exhausted by noon, and plagued by aches that made even simple tasks difficult. But Nathaniel was there for all of it, taking over her chores without complaint, rubbing her swollen feet at night, reading to her from his small collection of books. As autumn arrived and the air turned crisp, they prepared. Nathaniel built a cradle from the same cedar he had used for their bed, carving small horses into the headboard. Josephine sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her stitches careful and precise, each one a prayer. They did not speak of fear, of the possibility that something could go wrong. But it lived between them nonetheless, a shadow they both pretended not to see. Never. He turned her to face him. That day, you were hollow. Surviving, but not living. Now you are whole. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you move, in the way you smile at our son. That is what makes you beautiful. Tears welled in her eyes. How did I get so lucky? We both got lucky. Against all odds, we found each other. They stood there, holding each other in the lamplight, and Josephine thought about the long road that had brought them here. The auction block, the cold ride north, the locked door and the careful circling. The slow thaw of winter, the tentative trust, the moment when walls became bridges. She thought about all the things that could have gone wrong, all the ways the story could have ended in tragedy. And she marveled at the improbable grace that had saved them both. Nathaniel, she said softly. Yes? If you could go back, would you do it again? Bid on me, I mean. Knowing everything that would come after? He did not hesitate. Every time. In every life. I would find you, and I would bring you home. She kissed him then, slow and deep, and they went to bed wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the miracle of ordinary days and the extraordinary love that made them possible. The next morning, Nathaniel woke to find Josephine already up, standing at the window watching the sunrise. He joined her, and together they looked out over the land they had built together. Do you remember what you said to me that first night? Josephine asked. When I asked what you wanted from me? I said I wanted help, if you were willing. You gave me a choice when I had none. You gave me back my life. She turned to him. I want you to know that I would choose you again, too. Every time. Nathaniel pulled her close, and they stood there as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. The valley spread out before them, wild and beautiful, theirs by right of hard work and harder choices. And in that moment, with his wife in his arms and his son sleeping in the next room, Nathaniel Cross understood that redemption was not something granted by heaven or earned through suffering. It was something built, one choice at a time, one day at a time, by people brave enough to believe they deserved it. The story could have ended there, with them standing in the golden light, wrapped in hard-won peace. But life does not end with one perfect moment. It continues, messy and complicated and beautiful, until the very last breath. So they continued. They watched Thomas marry the girl with copper hair, watched him build his own homestead on the far side of the valley. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading roots deep into the hard soil of the territory. They buried friends, celebrated victories, weathered droughts and harsh winters. They argued and reconciled, hurt each other and healed each other, learned and relearned the art of loving someone through all the seasons of life. And when the end finally came, when Nathaniel lay in their bed with Josephine beside him, his breath growing shallow and his heartbeat faint, he looked at her with eyes that still held wonder. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For choosing to stay. She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his lips. Thank you for giving me something worth staying for. He smiled, the same slight smile he had given her on that first morning when she had woken in his house, uncertain and afraid. Then he closed his eyes and slipped away, his hand still wrapped in hers. Josephine wept, as one must when half their heart is torn away. But even through the tears, she knew she had been blessed. She had lived a life she never expected, loved a man who had saved her not with grand gestures but with quiet constancy, and built a family that would carry their story forward long after they were both gone. She lived 3 more years after Nathaniel died, spending her days tending the garden, playing with great-grandchildren, and sitting on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together. And when her own time came, she went peacefully, a smile on her lips, her last thought a memory of a lonely rancher with kind eyes who had bid too much at an auction and changed her life forever. They buried her beside him on the ridge, overlooking the valley where they had built their impossible life. And if you go there now, you can still see the stones, weathered and worn, 2 lives marked by simple names and the dates that bookend their years. But the real monument is not the stones. It is the land itself, still worked by their descendants, still wild and beautiful. It is in the stories told around dinner tables, in the way their great-great-grandchildren treat strangers with kindness, in the stubborn belief that broken things can be mended and lost people can be found. It is in the knowledge that sometimes, the greatest love stories are the ones that start with the worst circumstances. That sometimes, the deepest connections are forged not in comfort, but in the shared struggle to survive. That sometimes, the most beautiful lives are built from the wreckage of the ones we thought we were supposed to live. And it is in the understanding that we are all, in our own ways, standing on auction blocks, waiting for someone to see our worth. And that the greatest gift we can give each other is the freedom to choose, the space to heal, and the courage to love again, even when the world has given us every reason not to. But before those final years, before the peace of old age settled over them like a warm blanket, there were seasons of struggle that tested the foundation they had built together. It happened in the 7th year of their marriage, when Thomas was 3 years old and the ranch had grown prosperous enough to draw attention. Crenshaw, the man who had orchestrated Josephine's sale, arrived unannounced one scorching afternoon in July, accompanied by 2 hired guns and a lawyer from Denver. Nathaniel was in the far pasture when they arrived, which meant Josephine faced them alone. She stood on the porch, Thomas clinging to her skirt, as Crenshaw dismounted with the slow deliberation of a man who believed the world owed him deference. "Mrs. Cross," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Or should I say, Mrs. Hartley? I am not certain the first sale was properly dissolved before the second transaction." Josephine's blood went cold, but her voice remained steady. "My husband died. His debts were paid through the auction. You know this." Crenshaw smiled, a thin cruel thing that did not reach his eyes. "Debts, yes. But there was property, too. Your husband had a claim, filed properly with the territorial office. A silver claim up in the northern hills. Worth quite a bit, as it turns out. David never found silver. He died before he could work the claim." "Ah, but the claim exists. And as his widow, you inherited it. Which means when you were sold, the claim should have transferred to me as your creditor." He gestured to the lawyer, who produced a sheaf of papers. "I have come to collect what is rightfully mine." Josephine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had known David filed a claim, had known he dreamed of finding silver, but she had assumed it died with him, worthless and forgotten. "The claim is mine," she said, though her voice wavered. "If it has any value, it belongs to me and my husband. Your current husband has no legal right to property you brought into the marriage without proper documentation." Crenshaw's smile widened. "Unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "Sign the claim over to me, and I will forget this unfortunate confusion. Refuse, and I will take it to court. And Mrs. Cross, I have very expensive lawyers who specialize in making sure men like your husband lose everything they have built." Thomas whimpered, sensing his mother's distress. Josephine pulled him closer, her mind racing. She knew men like Crenshaw. Knew they did not make threats they could not carry out. "I need to speak with my husband." "Of course. I will return tomorrow for your answer." Crenshaw replaced his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, his hired guns flanking him like shadows. Josephine stood on the porch long after they disappeared, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything they had built, everything they had worked for, could be taken away by a man who dealt in cruelty the way others dealt in cattle. When Nathaniel returned at dusk, she told him everything. They sat at the kitchen table, Thomas asleep in his room, and went over every detail. "He cannot take the claim," Nathaniel said finally. "You inherited it before we married. It is yours." "But," he said, "without proper documentation." "Then we will get documentation. We will ride to the territorial office, file whatever needs filing, and make sure everything is legal and binding." "And if that is not enough? If he takes us to court anyway?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Then we will fight. I did not bring you home to watch you be stolen away by a man like that." They rode to the territorial office the next morning, leaving Thomas with a neighboring ranch wife they trusted. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, reviewed their documents and confirmed what they had hoped: the claim was Josephine's, and her marriage to Nathaniel did not change that unless she chose to transfer it. However, the clerk added, pushing his spectacles up his nose, if there was any irregularity in the original auction, if it can be proven that debts were not properly settled, then Mr. Crenshaw might have grounds to challenge the transfer. The auction was legal, Josephine insisted. "I was there. Everything was done according to law." "Then you should be fine. But I would recommend hiring a lawyer, just to be safe. Mr. Crenshaw is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully." They returned home to find Crenshaw waiting on their porch, his patience apparently exhausted. This time, he was not alone. With him stood Sheriff Barlow, a man Nathaniel knew to be firmly in Crenshaw's pocket. "Mr. Cross," the sheriff said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I have been instructed to inform you that Mr. Crenshaw has filed a legal claim against your wife for property theft. Until the matter is resolved, the Northern Hills claim is frozen, and any profits derived from it must be held in escrow." "There are no profits," Nathaniel said evenly. "The claim has never been worked." "Nevertheless." The sheriff handed him a document. "You are both required to appear in court in Denver in 3 weeks. Failure to appear will result in a default judgment in Mr. Crenshaw's favor." After they left, Nathaniel and Josephine stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a physical thing. "We cannot afford a Denver lawyer," Josephine said quietly. "And even if we could, Crenshaw can afford better ones. We will find a way." But as the days passed, the way became less and less clear. Word of the legal dispute spread through the territory, and suddenly, people who had been friendly became distant. Merchants who had extended credit demanded payment. Neighbors who had borrowed tools returned them with awkward excuses about needing them back. It was as if Crenshaw's shadow had fallen over their entire lives, tainting everything it touched. The night before they were to leave for Denver, Josephine could not sleep. She rose from bed, careful not to wake Nathaniel, and went to the porch. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like spilled salt, and the air was cool with the promise of autumn. She heard the door open behind her, felt Nathaniel's presence before he spoke. "Thinking about running?" he asked softly. She turned to him, surprised. "What? You have that look. The same one you had the night you tried to leave, when you were still pregnant and afraid." "I am not running." "Then what?" She sighed, leaning against the porch rail. "I am thinking about how much easier your life would be if you had never met me. If you had let someone else bid on me that day." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to stand beside her, his shoulder touching hers. "Do you know what I was thinking that day at the auction? Before I bid?" "What?" "I was thinking that I was already dead. That I had been dead for 7 years, just going through the motions of living because I did not know what else to do." He turned to face her. "And then I saw you. And something in me that I thought was gone forever woke up. So I bid. Not to save you, not even because I wanted a wife. I bid because in that moment, you made me feel alive again." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. And now I have brought nothing but trouble. You have brought me everything. A son. A home that feels like a home. A reason to wake up in the morning. Whatever happens in Denver, whatever Crenshaw does, it does not change that. He wiped her tears with his thumb. We face this together, the same way we have faced everything else. She nodded, unable to speak, and let him hold her under the indifferent stars. The journey to Denver took 4 days. They left Thomas with the neighbor, though it tore at Josephine's heart to leave him. The boy had cried, clinging to her skirt, and she had promised they would return soon. She prayed it was not a lie. Denver was a different world from the territories. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, streets were paved with cobblestones, and the air smelled of coal smoke and ambition. They found lodging in a modest boarding house and met with the lawyer Nathaniel had managed to hire, a young man fresh from law school named Benjamin Walsh. Walsh was earnest and hard-working, but even he seemed daunted by the stack of documents Crenshaw's lawyers had filed. They are claiming fraud, Walsh explained, spreading papers across his small desk. They say the original auction was conducted improperly, that debts were still outstanding, and therefore the transfer of property was invalid. That is a lie, Josephine said. Perhaps. But they have witnesses who will testify otherwise. Men who worked in Crenshaw's mine, who will say your husband owed more than what was settled. Those men will say whatever Crenshaw pays them to say. Walsh nodded grimly. Which is why we need our own witnesses. People who were at the auction, who can confirm everything was done legally. But finding witnesses proved difficult. The auctioneer, Polk, had died the previous winter. Others who had been present either could not be found or refused to get involved, afraid of Crenshaw's retribution. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and older anger. The judge was a stern man named Holloway, known for his strict interpretation of the law. Crenshaw sat at the plaintiff's table with his 3 lawyers, looking confident and comfortable. Nathaniel and Josephine sat beside Walsh, holding hands beneath the table. The prosecution went first, calling witness after witness, each one testifying to David Hartley's supposed debts, to irregularities in the auction, to claims that Josephine had hidden assets. It was a masterful performance, each lie built upon the last until the truth seemed buried beneath the weight of false testimony. Walsh did his best to cross-examine, to expose the contradictions, but Crenshaw's lawyers were skilled at redirecting, at planting doubt. When it was finally their turn, Walsh called Josephine to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head high, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then she told her story. All of it. The mining camp, her mother's cruelty, David's kindness, his death in the collapse. The debts that were real and the auction that had been legal. The night she had arrived at Nathaniel's homestead, afraid and alone. She spoke clearly, without drama, letting the truth carry its own weight. And when she finished, the courtroom was silent. Crenshaw's lead lawyer, a silver-haired man named Thornton, approached for cross-examination. Mrs. Cross, he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. You paint quite a picture of yourself as a victim. But is it not true that you profited greatly from this supposed victimhood? You married a man of property, gained a comfortable home, even had a child. All benefits that came directly from the auction you now claim was legal. The auction was legal. And I did not profit. I survived. Semantics, Mrs. Cross. The fact remains that you have much to gain by maintaining this fiction. The only fiction here is the one you are creating. Thornton's expression hardened. You claim your husband died in a mine collapse. But is it not true that he was known to be reckless, that he took unnecessary risks? He was forced to take risks because Mr. Crenshaw provided no safety equipment, no proper supports. The collapse was not David's fault. It was Crenshaw's. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Crenshaw's face darkened. Your Honor, Thornton said quickly, the witness is making unfounded accusations. Unfounded? Josephine turned to the judge. 12 men died in that collapse. 12 men who were fathers, husbands, sons. And not one of them had to die if Mr. Crenshaw had spent money on safety instead of profit. Mrs. Cross, the judge said sternly, you are here to answer questions about property law, not to make accusations about mining practices. But they are connected, Your Honor. Mr. Crenshaw killed my husband through negligence, then tried to profit from his death by selling me at auction. Now he wants to profit again by stealing the one thing David left behind. When does it end? When does a man like that finally pay for what he has done? The courtroom erupted. Spectators shouted, Crenshaw's lawyers objected, and the judge banged his gavel for order. But Josephine had said what needed saying, and she sat back in her chair with her spine straight and her conscience clear. The trial continued for 2 more days. Walsh called other witnesses, including the clerk from the territorial office, who confirmed that Josephine's claim was properly filed and legal. But Crenshaw's lawyers continued their assault, filing motion after motion, introducing document after document. Finally, on the 4th day, both sides rested. The judge took a recess to consider his verdict. Nathaniel and Josephine waited in a small park near the courthouse, sitting on a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. Thomas would be missing them, wondering when they would return. The ranch would need tending, the cattle would need moving to winter pasture. But all of that felt distant, unreal, as if their entire life hung suspended, waiting for a man in a black robe to decide their fate. Whatever happens, Nathaniel said, we will find a way through it. Josephine leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I am tired of fighting. I know. But we are not done yet. The judge returned after 2 hours. They filed back into the courtroom, took their seats, and waited as Judge Holloway arranged his papers and cleared his throat. This case, he began, has been one of the most contentious I have presided over in my 20 years on the bench. Both sides have presented compelling arguments, and both sides have made serious accusations. Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers. However, the judge continued, at its heart, this is a matter of property law. And the law is clear. Mrs. Cross inherited the mining claim from her deceased husband before her remarriage. The claim was properly filed with the territorial office. The auction that settled Mr. Hartley's debts was conducted according to established procedures, and I have seen no credible evidence to suggest otherwise. A weight lifted from Josephine's chest, but she forced herself to remain still, to wait for the rest. Therefore, I find in favor of the defendants. The mining claim remains the sole property of Mrs. Josephine Cross. Mr. Crenshaw's petition is denied, and he is ordered to pay court costs and legal fees for the defense. The gavel came down with a crack like thunder. Crenshaw shot to his feet, his face purple with rage, but his lawyers pulled him back, whispering urgently. Nathaniel and Josephine sat frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe what they had heard. Then Walsh turned to them, grinning. You won. We won, Josephine whispered. Then, louder, we won. They left Denver the next morning, eager to return home, to see Thomas, to put the whole ordeal behind them. But as they rode through the mountains, Josephine found herself thinking about Crenshaw's face in that courtroom, the fury and humiliation written there. He will not let this go, she said to Nathaniel as they made camp the second night. Men like him never do. Perhaps. But there is nothing more he can take from us legally. And anything else would be a crime. You think that will stop him? Nathaniel poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. No. But it gives us grounds to act if he tries. They reached home on the 4th day, exhausted and trail-worn but triumphant. Thomas ran to meet them, launching himself into Josephine's arms with such force he nearly knocked her over. The neighbor who had been watching him smiled and reported that the boy had been good, if a bit lonely. That night, after Thomas was tucked into bed and the house was quiet, Nathaniel and Josephine sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Do you ever wonder about it?" Josephine asked. "The claim, I mean. Whether there is actually silver there?" "Sometimes." "Do you want to find out?" She considered the question. Part of her wanted nothing to do with anything connected to Crenshaw, wanted to let the claim lie fallow and forgotten. But another part, the part that had survived her mother's cruelty and the auction block, wanted to prove that she was worth more than what men like Crenshaw believed. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I do." They hired a prospector the following spring, an old man named Silas who had been finding silver since before the war. He spent 2 weeks in the northern hills, taking samples, following veins, and mapping the claim. When he returned, his report was cautious but hopeful. "There is silver there," he said, spreading his maps on their kitchen table. "Not a fortune, mind you, but enough to be worth working. You would need to hire men, buy equipment, invest money you might not see back for a year or two. But if you are patient, it could pay off." Nathaniel and Josephine looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. "We will do it," Josephine said. "But we do it right. Proper supports, safety equipment, fair wages. Everything Crenshaw refused to do." And so they did. They sold some cattle, took out a small loan from a Denver bank that had heard about their court victory and wanted to support them, and hired 6 men to work the claim. Nathaniel supervised the construction of the mine entrance, the installation of timber supports, the creation of a safe and functional operation. It was hard, expensive, and exhausting. There were weeks when Josephine wondered if they had made a terrible mistake, if they should have let the claim remain dormant. But gradually, slowly, silver began to emerge from the dark earth. Not in vast quantities, but steadily, reliably. Enough to pay the workers, cover the loan, and provide a buffer against hard times. More importantly, it provided something else, proof that David Hartley's dream had not been foolish, that his death had not been meaningless, that Josephine's fight to keep his legacy had been worth it. 2 years after the trial, word reached them that Crenshaw had died, felled by a stroke while arguing with a business partner. Josephine felt nothing when she heard the news, no satisfaction, no relief. The man who had caused so much pain was simply gone, and the world continued turning. But that night, she visited David's grave for the first time since marrying Nathaniel. It was a simple marker in the cemetery at Redemption Springs, and she knelt before it with wildflowers in her hands. "I kept it," she whispered, placing the flowers on the stone. "Your claim. Our dream. It was not in vain." She stayed there as the sun set, saying goodbye to the boy she had loved in another life, thanking him for the kindness he had shown her, forgiving him for leaving her alone in a hard world. Then she rose, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and rode home to the man who had given her a second chance at living. The years continued their steady march. Thomas grew into a fine young man, serious and hard-working like his father, with his mother's gray eyes and stubborn determination. The ranch prospered. The mine produced enough silver to provide security without consuming their lives. And Nathaniel and Josephine grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like fine whiskey, becoming something rich and complex that could not be easily defined or explained. They had earned it, this peace, this contentment. Earned it through struggle and perseverance, through choosing each other every day, through refusing to let the cruelty of the world harden their hearts or break their spirits. And when people asked them, as they sometimes did, how they had built such a life from such difficult beginnings, they always gave the same answer. We chose to believe that broken things could be mended. And then we did the work.